Welcome again to Perspectives on Closing Loopholes. We created this series to explore the raft of industrial relations changes in Australia. We've brought together some of the most incredible, knowledgeable industrial minds in the country because we wanted to hear the different perspectives of our key stakeholders. We'll discuss what the changes mean to employees, employers, and participants in the industrial relations system. We've had a fantastic response to our guests to date, and we have had some incredible speakers, from His Honour President Hatcher, the President of the Fair Work Commission, Professor Ron McCallum, Frank Parry KC, a preeminent industrial silk, and Jess Tinsley, the Director of Workplace Relations and General Counsel at ACCI. If you've not seen those episodes yet, they're available on our website, or you can get them wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Shae McCartney, and I'm pleased to host this series with my partner Matt Kelleher on behalf of our National Workplace Relations team. But before I start, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land and waters on which we gather. We recognise their ongoing strength and resilience and the important role that they play as leaders in our community, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Matt, I'll get you to introduce our guest today. I'm very excited to hear from her.
Thanks very much, Shae. Yes, as am I. And today we have a very special guest, the National Workplace Relations Regulator, the Fair Work Ombudsman, Anna Booth. Thanks very much for joining us, Anna. You've had an extensive and diverse career for the benefit of our viewers. I'll touch on that. A career spanning over 45 years in industrial relations. Prior to your commencement as the Fair Work Ombudsman, you were a director and co-founder of CoSolve, an independent company providing facilitation services for workplaces. Of course, prior to that, you were the deputy president of the Fair Work Commission, and earlier spent much of your career in the union movement and were the youngest and first female federal secretary of a union when you became the national secretary of the Textile, Clothing and Footwear Union of Australia, and you were also the vice president of the ACTU. 1 year into your term, Fair Work Ombudsman, you were appointed on the 1st of September 2023. I'm sure you've got a lot of fantastic insights to share with us today, and we really can't wait to hear what they are and get your perspective on the recent legislative reforms.
Well, thank you, Matt, and thank you, Shae. I'm really pleased to be here.
And I'm sorry we didn't bring you cake for your 1 year anniversary.
I know. I'm hoping there'll be a surprise party, but I just don't know.
Congratulations on the first year. How has it been?
It has been phenomenal, actually, phenomenal. I have never run an organisation before, which means that the appointment was very brave on the part of the selection panel and the minister, but I'm finding it very fulfilling, and so far, it seems, haven't completely stuffed up.
Certainly not. It's gone very fast. Perhaps not so for yourself. There's been a lot happening that we'll get to.
Yeah.
But before we do that, I do want to go to your statement of intent.
Sure.
You've outlined that the FWO is to take a collaborative approach in its enforcement and compliance regulation, and you were quoted with the Australian Institute of Company Directors as hoping to, or aiming to create permanent change in Australian workplaces by dealing with the cause of the illness, not the symptoms. Can you tell us more about what you mean in relation to the collaborative approach, particularly in light of an era of significantly increased maximum penalties in the regulation space, which we will get to shortly, and what you meant by that?
Sure, yes. I am married to a barrister of about 35 years standing, and of course I'm surrounded in the Fair Work Ombudsman by lawyers, so I always love it when you are seeking to understand something and the lawyer just says, well, what does the Act say? Mm-hmm. And so reading the statute is a really good place to start. So Section 682 of the Fair Work Act creates the Fair Work Ombudsman and gives it our purpose. And that purpose is to promote harmonious, cooperative, productive and compliant workplaces. And I think what really sums up the need for a collaborative approach is that you really can't have compliant workplaces unless you've got productive workplaces. You can't have them unless they're cooperative. And equally, the compliance underpins that cooperation and that productivity. So to me, it's circular, and the purpose of of the Act as it's stated in Section 682 is something that we really take very seriously. And it means that I think you have to take the whole workplace community into the theatre. All actors have a place. It's our job to listen very carefully to why it is that contraventions are occurring and what the sectors need to be voluntarily compliant. And then we have to act together, because whilst it's the employer's primary obligation to pay correctly and to uphold workplace standards, I don't think they can do that alone. I think they need the support of their workforce and their workforce's representatives, unions, and particularly their employer organisation. And if we have all of those parts of the system working cooperatively, reinforcing each other, being consistent, sometimes acting together, sometimes acting in parallel, then we have a chance of making that permanent change. So, I'm really interested in sustainable compliance, and I think it is about harnessing the workplace participants. The truth is that every sector is different. So what drives non-compliance, and indeed on the positive side, what drives voluntary compliance, in each sector it's different. And I would just give an example of two very different sectors, for example, the fast food restaurants and cafes sector, where, and I've got a figure here, 89% of all the workplaces that we've visited and of the complaints we've received, 89% find the employer has contravened the Act in one way or another. It's a very high figure. And there's a lot going on in that sector that underpins that. We have to understand that before we can design strategies to help employers maintain compliance. Universities, completely different. We've recovered $128 million for at university employees, a lot of them casual academic staff. What drives the non-compliance in that sector is quite different. So we need to get those groups together. We also need, and we get them together in order to listen to them and in order to co-design strategies, but we also need a kind of authorising environment for that. So that's where we have an overarching advisory group that contains the ACTU on the one hand and the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Australian Industry Group, Business Council of Australia and COSBOA. On the other hand, we bring them together for the larger strategic piece and to consult them on things that we'll talk about more, Matt, today, like our compliance and enforcement policy, but then we have these sector reference groups where we are hoping to co-design specific interventions.
Fascinating, thanks Anna. And a couple of topics that you touched on there that is a great segue to our next question that Shae will ask. Every sector is different. Compliance and a pro-compliance culture is important. We've read and heard a lot, particularly in recent weeks, about the CFMEU.
Yep.
Also a sector that falls under your regulation now. Shae has some questions for you on that.
So there obviously has been a lot published recently relating to CFMEU and serious allegations of corruption and retaliation against businesses and individuals who speak up against alleged criminal activities. The role of the Fair Work Ombudsman in the building sector has also featured in some of those articles. And I thought it might be worthwhile to start by just outlining, I guess, what is the Fair Work Ombudsman's enforcement approach in terms of investigating allegations and its role that it plays in the enforcement and construction industry.
So we have a building and construction reference group as well, because it is one of our priority areas. It's the second largest employer in Australia. So it is so important that we build harmonious, cooperative, productive and compliant workplaces in building and construction. The building and construction sector has 1.3 million workers. 15% of those are young workers. And I think I'd like to position our role in building and construction in what we call the compliance triangle, which people involved in regulation watching this video will no doubt understand. But there's a triangle that was created by an academic called John Braithwaite that really just simply sets out that he has a number of levels in his, much more complicated than my simple explanation. But really you're looking at the base of the triangle at voluntary compliance and what is it that the Fair Work Ombudsman does to to encourage voluntary compliance? Well, clearly we educate and we engage, and we do things like this, speak in Clayton Utz podcasts. Then there's a level which is guided compliance, kind of in the middle of the triangle. So that's when employers have gone off track, but the circumstances are such that we have confidence that they can get back on track. And when I say employers, I mean actually all workplace participants have got off track, because that's pertinent to your question. And so we have a range of guided compliance instruments, which I think we're going to talk more about later. And then, of course, there's the tip of the triangle where forced compliance is necessary because of the lack of cooperation or for other reasons. So we want to take the same approach to building and construction that we take to the industry generally. And we want to focus in, though, on the needs of the sector. So it would be, I think it would be absolutely fair to say that in terms of representational rights and responsibilities, it's the sector where we do have most non-compliance. And for that reason, we actually have not just a building and construction special team that works internally and works with our building and construction reference group, but we have an industrial compliance subgroup of that team. And we have been working obviously long before the Building Bad series occurred on improving behaviour in building and construction. You know that some of the, well, all of the responsibilities and only some of the powers of the Australian Building and Construction Commission were transferred to the, and I think it was November 2022, and then I arrived in September of 2023. So ever since I've arrived, I've been focusing on that voluntary compliance wedge of the triangle. And just recently we've worked with some employer organisation, the Fair Work Commission and the ACTU on building a representational rights and responsibilities guide, so that we really can kind of make the legislation about representational rights and responsibilities live in behavioural terms for people. And I think even though at the moment we're dealing with what might be called a crisis, you've got to play a long game and you've got to be ready, and we are ready indeed to work with the administrator to help culture change in that union. But the industry as a whole is very complex, and so whilst at the moment all the focus is on the CFMEU and all the focus is on behaviour that is alleged to have occurred, really the building and construction industry is a big focus for us generally. And at the moment we've got 17 litigations on foot in relation to building construction. Not all of them relate to the CFMEU, and in the last 2 years we've recovered $7.25 million in underpaid wages.
Right. Sort of following on from that, the Minister has written to the Ombudsman regarding alleged serious misconduct within the union, and I understand has asked you to investigate allegations in relation to particularly the making of enterprise agreements. And as I understand that, that's in relation to allegations maybe regarding coercion or
misrepresentation.
So can you tell us about how that investigation is progressing, whether you anticipate pursuing anything out of that? Or is there anything you can tell us about that investigation?
I can stick to process. I can't give you substance, and that's for the obvious reason that
it's not complete.
once something's in investigation, you can't besmirch people until you've actually got to a point of taking action. But we have written to the 500 major players in the big build in Victoria. We have more generally put the word out to the building and construction industry, please speak up. We're working in consultation with the Fair Work Commission in that regard as well, and they've put on the front page of their website a request for information. We have also got a front page anonymous reporting portal on the front page of our website, and we are asking the building and construction industry to use that portal. If they want to remain anonymous, that's fine, because the whole purpose of the investigation that has started by writing to those 500 builders on the big build is to get as much information as we can, and of course we'd like it attributed. Ultimately, we have to have it attributed to track through finally to enforcement, but also we want to see what the patterns and themes are that are coming out from the anonymous intelligence. So within the month of October, we'll provide a full report to the Minister. That report really will be divided into two parts where we can actually indicate course of action arising from attributed information, and as I said, patterns and themes that emerge from the anonymous dangerous. I and my General Manager of Operations, Michael Campbell, are getting out and about as we can. We're going to be talking to, we're going to be doing another video next week in relation to the industry with the Civil Contractors Association. I've written to all of the members of the Building Construction Reference Group on the employer's side and offered our presence in their member meetings, and hitherto, as far as I'm aware, we haven't been taken up on that, but it's early days. And then just, generally we intend to follow this through to the last piece of evidence that we've got. And, that can be frustrating for people looking at us. I know before I became Fair Work Ombudsman, I didn't have any understanding of just the depth and the care that needed to be taken, when you were undertaking an investigation, when you were asking people to go on the record in interviews and so on. It's very painstaking. So honestly, it could be several years of activity. And look, you only have to look at some of our compliance notices where we issue them in relation to an employer. Let's say 2020 and 2022, the matter comes on in court. So that's what you can expect. But in the meantime, we will give the Minister a preliminary report, and it'll be a matter for him as to whether he makes that public.
It's an incredible amount of work in such a very short period of time. So I commend you for and feel sorry for you having
well, thank you.
to
And,
do that.
I'd like to remind everybody that we have 1 million workplaces, in our jurisdiction, and 14 million workers. Yeah. And the theme of your vodcasts is closing the loopholes, and you know that we have a raft of new rights and obligations that have arrived through that
well, you had a big business as usual change as it was.
And we have an education role, but ultimately we also have an enforcement role in relation to a lot of those new rights and obligations. So it's a busy place.
Yep, and made busier at the moment. But I guess what I'm hearing is that if people have issues they'd like to raise, they should be going to your website and lodging them. They can do so anonymously.
And it's on the front of the website. So you just click on to fairwork.gov.au and there it is. Do you have a workplace issue? Click.
Beautiful. And I think there's been some confusion certainly in people people I was listening to who were talking next to me on the plane, for example, and it was all I could do to not interrupt them to clarify. But can you explain the Fair Work Ombudsman's role with respect to the administration, and do you expect to have any role in the administration?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have no legislative role. So the legislation does not give us a particular role, as it does, of course, give a role to the Fair Work Commission. But we very much are a partner with the Fair Work Commission, and we want to be a partner with the administrator. So we are already in, I don't know about daily, but we're certainly every other day, I would say. Our Chief Counsel, Rachel Volsky, will be speaking with the staff of the administrator, and I've asked her at the earliest possible opportunity to raise the desire that I have for a formal relationship. So I want it to be laid down in protocols. I want it to be regular. I want it to be responsive as well as proactive. So from the administrator's point of view, if there's anything that we have that can help him in the conduct of administration, we will prepare. Our staff will assist, and if we have some ideas, I want to be able to share them. And I do have an idea, and that is, the work that I mentioned before that we'd already started prior to the Building Bad series. I've been in industrial relations for a very long time, as you said, over 40 years. It's actually over 45 years. I've worked in the Fair Work Commission.
I keep lying about how old I've been doing things because I'm lying about my age now. So you don't need to correct that.
I've got to that point.
It might become 35 by
next
by the next
I've got
video.
to that point as well. But when I was in the Fair Work Commission, I started what is now called the Collaborative Workplaces Program. And I've seen with my own eyes just how cathartic, really, really good engagement processes can be when they're invested in, when there's a will to do them. And I think the CFMEU will be reborn, as a great trade union. And I want to have a part in the behaviour change. And that means normalising the way in which organisers and officials engage with employers and the way in which employers engage with them. So that's what our work's all about. And it hasn't come to fruition yet, so it's always dangerous to foreshadow something people build expectations.
But to the administrator, completely off topic, topic, but I keep coming back to really what the construction industry needs is more women, because it might then regulate a whole lot of behaviours.
That's a bit the same as, my introductory comments, how things are circular, one thing depends on the other. So, famous movie, Catch-22. And I think the ALP is a really great example of this. So, now we've got 50-50 women in Parliament, at least on the government side, and in terms of the ministry and the cabinet. We've already heard them speak about what difference that makes, and we've heard men speak about what difference it makes to have women. And no doubt in your law firm, you have this experience. It's not that we're shrinking violets by any manner of means, but our presence just creates a different aura. And all of the effort that they have made in the building and construction industry to improve women's participation had very minimal effect. I think that it is a catch-22. You've got to get that critical mass of women in, and then women beget women, and then that's when you'll flip. But of course, we haven't got time for that. So we need actually to be doing two things at once. We need to be, we need to tackle values and beliefs and interests, and we need to. Again, as I said at the outset, to make permanent change, you need to understand why is someone behaving the way they are. What is it that they perceive they're getting? What's the payoff? What's the payoff? And if we can achieve that a different way, this is not about making a tame cat union that will not strive for members' improved terms and conditions, but it's about doing it in a way which is constructive and allows an ongoing relationship and a growth and a success in the industry, which whenever I've sat down with unions and employers in my FWC days, the first thing people acknowledged was the common interest in the success of the enterprise or the success of the industry.
And of the relationship.
Yeah.
Perhaps we'll go back to some of the business as usual changes, but in particular relating to criminalisation of wage theft.
You touched on some of the more recent changes and the impact that has on sort of business as usual in terms of operations. One of the big changes arising out of the recent legislative reforms is a significant new power for the Fair Work Ombudsman, the criminalisation of wage theft arising from intentional underpayment of employees. Yep. Certainly gained a lot of traction, a lot of talk within the business community around how that will be deployed by you as the regulator. How are you, and obviously you're running what is historically, a civil regulator. What are you doing in that space in terms of upskilling the inspectors, building new capability, and how do you envisage deploying that significant new power?
So I'd like to go back to probably the end of last year. I'd only been in the role for 3 months, and I began to see, when I first started, the staff asked me the first week, I had, a whole series of town halls, and the question over and over again is, are we going to have a restructure? And I could see that this was not a question that didn't fill them with enthusiasm. And of course, my answer at that point was, I don't know. I'm not a restructurer for restructuring's sake, but let's just, let's get to know each other and see where we go. Well, by the time I had the Christmas break and came back in January, I thought, and of course knew then at that point, Closing Loopholes 2 was very well known. Obviously, Closing the Loopholes 1 had been passed. So I thought, really, it would be a good opportunity to restructure the organisation. So from 5 groups we went to 4. One of those 4 is operations, which is a very big group, and I wanted to bring all the education functions into operations so that it was a sort of seamless relationship with the promoting voluntary compliance and guided compliance and indeed forced compliance. But I also wanted to have an eye on the future. And so we created a whole group called Regulatory Transformation. And within that group, we have situated the criminal jurisdiction. So already as a dual regulator, we've kind of got, I wouldn't say Chinese walls, because it's not quite like that. In fact, we've got probably the opposite. We actually need a high degree of communication and collaboration across the walls. But obviously the majority of our activity is going to still be in the civil jurisdiction, no doubt about that. You mentioned the word intent. As you know better than me, the criminal threshold of proof is beyond reasonable doubt. So to rise to that level, that an employer has intentionally underpaid, and we're satisfied that we can meet the threshold threshold of beyond reasonable doubt, that is
Very
going to be
serious.
at the pointy end, of this compliance triangle I talk about. But nevertheless, we have to be prepared for it. So in that group, we are standing up the function which will include investigators that are specially trained. It will include all of the and all of the soft skills that go with investigating, but it will also include all of the technology and just the physical. I mean, just the other day in our corporate board, which is one of our 2 governance boards, we approved the expenditure for the creation of evidence rooms in 2 of our offices. So, we've got all of that's happening. We have been funded. Nearly $50 million over 4 years and $11 million per annum thereafter.
That's just
for the criminal jurisdiction. And we'll also be having to upskill our civil investigators as well. In fact, we are doing that in any event. They're all going through the Cert 4 in government investigations at the moment, which I'm really excited about. And so as a dual regulator, obviously there'll be a point at which a matter is handed over, and then a different leader, will be responsible for taking that forward. It's important to note that we investigate, but we don't prosecute. So in the civil jurisdiction, we do both. In the criminal jurisdiction, we pass over the matter to either the AFP or, more likely, the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions. And I always find it a mouthful to remember the initialism, which is CDPP. And it has to be a very well worked up case, I am sure. So there's got to be a lot of investment.
I have this image of a crack CSI team that are
yes, and in fact,
preparing their case to hand over to the prosecutor.
I'm excited that you make that analogy, because I mentioned Michael Campbell as the GM of our operations. The name of our head of regulatory transformation is Michelle Carey, and she's just got that little flavour about her. I think she would do very well in a CSI episode, actually, because she's also got, beyond the criminal, she's got a whole lot of transformative activity like technology, AI. I'm very keen for us to do as much as possible in the space of detecting and disrupting non-compliance through the use of AI. And we're working at the moment in a little microcosm of the job ads that where people advertise jobs underneath the minimum wage, and seeing, can I please release investigators from being on a roster and literally sitting, on their computer and going through the platforms looking for the underpaid job ads. Could we please do that by some technology? Because those investigators need to be out in the field, speaking to employers and workers about their
exciting time to be
treatment
employed
at work.
with the Ombudsman.
It's a common perception within corporate Australia, to an extent, that we have a complex system of awards, enterprise agreements, and that the vast majority of underpayments to employees are not intentional, they're inadvertent, and arise from the complexity of the system, or unsophisticated payroll systems within some employers, perhaps. How do you see the intersection with the criminalisation of wage theft and that perception within the business community?
Look, I think the best way of framing it is that compliance triangle again, if I can do that. And clearly there will be instances of intentional underpayment. And whilst, of course, matters that have already been to court in the civil jurisdiction, I would never name names and say, well, if that had occurred after the 1st of January 2025, it probably would have been criminal. But what I can say is the kind of behaviours like cashback, for example, or paying half of the wages, in electronically, and the other half in cash, and asking for that cash back, or just paying,
trotting people around to ATMs.
Exactly, or the very low minimum rates, the under $15 an hour. Those things, it's going to be hard to say those were unintentional. But the majority of our work, and where in fact we're putting a huge amount of our investment, is in that base of the triangle in building voluntary compliance. And then when it comes to the second wedge, the guided compliance wedge of the triangle, that's going to be where we see a lot of employers who have made mistakes. And there's a continuum of mistakes too. There's mistakes that are one-off and inadvertent, and already our compliance and enforcement policy says those matters can just be rectified, don't need to be reported. And then there's sort of quite inadvertent but quite large scale, and things that go back a long way because they discover a glitch in the payroll system, or they discover a mistaken interpretation of the award or the enterprise agreement, right through to circumstances where people have kind of turned a blind eye to a provision of the award. So that, there is a continuum, but nevertheless, most of those matters still stay in that guided compliance wedge, and it's only when you get, to the egregious things like our recent case with Shae, which of course was civil, but where we achieved our largest ever penalty, $15.3 million, and where it was very clear that it was a horrendous set of behaviours which had been repeated by that particular perpetrator.
We've got a couple of questions on that I'll come back to actually in respect to that particular case, Shae. Do you, just finally on the criminalisation aspect, historically the Fair Work Ombudsman has had particular sectors that it has targeted for various reasons, very valid reasons, I would say. Do you anticipate having a similar approach to that as you expand and commence this new wage criminalisation offering?
So the intention to date is to maintain our sectoral approach, because that is based on risk and certainly borne out by experience when I mentioned, for example, that figure in those statistics. And so we wouldn't necessarily subdivide potential criminal matters by sectors, but obviously we'll be on the lookout in particular sectors we know where we anticipate there might be greater likelihood of intentionality. We'll be on the lookout for it. But as I said before, being having a dual jurisdiction in the regulator, it'll largely start in operations with the civil examination, and then if they get a whiff, it'll be sort of passed over to the criminal.
You're talking about the middle piece, I guess, of the spectrum where, perhaps there's larger scale but inadvertent, and employers have identified a mistake or a problem in their payments, or identified underpayments, I guess. We have this new regime of the corporations agreement framework, which is I guess, a safe harbour for employers to identify non-compliance and to enter into these agreements with you. Could you talk to us a little bit about those cooperation agreements and perhaps the guidelines or the circumstances in which they'll be appropriate and the Ombudsman would consider entering into them?
And thank you, Shae, for reminding it. I should have mentioned that specifically when we started to talk about the criminal jurisdiction, that there are these two safe harbour, and I'll come to the cooperation agreements, but there's also, of course, the voluntary code for small business, and that's a document that's well on its way to being ready, and indeed the criminal jurisdiction can't begin until the Minister has declared it. So we're well on the way through our consultation process with both, with all the stakeholders who are represented on our advisory group, who happen to be more or less the same, not just the same stakeholders, but sometimes the same people that are on the National Workplace Relations Consultative Council, I think it's called, NWRCC. I do wish people would design things so that they are proper acronyms.
You do have to be careful with some of the acronyms too.
That's true.
They can go very badly wrong.
There's the flow.
The flow is a good one.
Yes, my husband, before I was appointed, when we had some anticipation about whether I would or I wouldn't be, and obviously no knowledge of it, he used to walk around the house going, "Go with the flow, go with the flow." But coming back to the criminal jurisdiction, so as well as the code, which is a safe harbour specifically for small business, that if we judge that they have complied with it, we are enabled to commence a criminal action. There is, for all businesses, the cooperation agreement. And it has some features similar to an enforceable undertaking, and some of the same kind of circumstances or factors that we would consider favourably in entering a cooperation agreement have, I think, some kind of analogy, to the enforceable undertaking. We're not ready to tell you exactly, what our indicia are going to be, but of course what I can tell you is that Section 717B of the Fair Work Act makes it clear about what are the circumstances where a cooperation agreement would be appropriate, and they are whether, in the flow's view, the employer has made a voluntary, frank and complete disclosure of the conduct, the nature and level of the detail of that disclosure, the employer's cooperation with the FWO, which is certainly one of the things we take into account when we consider entering into a enforceable undertaking, their commitment to continued cooperation. So that's important. I think our cooperation agreement again has that flavour of an enforceable undertaking because there's a future focus to it. The nature and gravity of the conduct, the circumstances in which it occurred and the employer's compliance history. So that's quite a helpful statutory set of indicia. I'm not sure if we're going to vastly improve on that, but what we might do is fill that out a little bit more, perhaps with some examples. We'll do that in consultation with our stakeholders, both on the union movement side as well as the employer organisation side. And that'll be therefore available for the circumstances where we might form a belief that a contravention does rise to the criminal standard. Then, to be clear, if we do decide to enter into a cooperation agreement with that employer, and remember it can be any sized employer, that is a full protection against the matter being proceeded with criminally, but not civilly. So that's important.
And so how does that then compare with the enforceable undertaking? So obviously you have a range of tools at your disposal and you have used enforceable undertakings quite extensively. Yes. Do you still see that they will have a significant place in your toolkit?
I love enforceable undertakings. When I say that, though, I must also not assume, or not let anyone assume that I only like to use enforceable undertakings, because I do definitely see a role for the general and specific deterrence, that a litigation provides. In some cases, the conditions, for an enforceable undertaking just aren't there, and even if they are there a little bit, we still think that for the strategic or the impact that we might have systemically on a sector, it's worthwhile taking litigation. But an enforceable undertaking will definitely be part of the toolkit, criminally as well as civilly. I actually see them being used more. For the last few years, they've tended to be used mainly for large corporates that have self-disclosed large underpayments that go back a long time, and those large corporates have been cooperative with us and have wanted to remedy the situation and have wanted to put in place, frameworks and processes for the future so that it doesn't happen again. That's the kind of conditions that an enforceable undertaking is attractive to be made. But I would like to use them for smaller, medium and small employers. I think they can. The beauty of an enforceable undertaking is that it can contain almost anything that you can agree. It's not bounded, by the same statutory considerations that penalties are, and I think it's just as applicable in this whole representational rights and responsibilities space as well. And yet it hasn't been used. Who knows if it had been? I know. I can't say that we wouldn't have got to where we are with building bad, but I would like to give it a bit. I've got 4 more years, and I want to give it a really good shot. To cause people to reflect upon themselves, and that's employers and employees. And I think enforceable undertakings are a perfect instrument. It actually enables you to contain all those reflections, and people make commitments. They put their hands on their hearts and they say, we will not do this again, and here's how we'll avoid it. And one of the ways of doing that is, again, coming back to the tripartism that we began with, is to have workers and their organisations and employers and their organisations in close dialogue, so that red flags can be raised when things go wrong, and we're not waiting for 10 years to find out that there was a glitch in the payroll system and we now owe $10 million.
And certainly in the safety space, enforceable undertakings have been used to actually create genuine community and industry improvements that have gone beyond, that there's obviously the deterrence, but deterrence works for people who are deliberately contravening, whereas a lot of the enforceable undertakings have actually really helped educate and helped enlighten and innovate, there's no reason why they can't be in the same.
And you raise a really important thing too, and in the same way that the FWO is not an island in terms of the workplace regulation system, neither is it an island in terms of regulators more generally. And so that's another thing that we've really ramped up, is our relationship with other regulators, and Safe Work Australia is one of them. And I really do think think we can learn from each other, not just read each other's statute, but actually learn from the experience that each other have got in applying the statute, as well as in some cases co-regulate. So, the Fair Work Ombudsman already goes out into the field with Border Force, for example, on the ATO at times, the labour hire authorities. So I want that to become much more routine, and it would be no surprise to see us arriving in a workplace or on a farm, with our other regulators all together.
Yeah,
a
fantastic.
gaggle of regulators. I'm not quite sure what the collective noun is.
You'll have to come up with
maybe a rabble of regulators.
Speaking of this importance of deterrence, significant penalties were recently imposed in a case that you've touched on already.
Yes.
Sushi Bay against
Yes.
Sushi Bay
Yes.
outlets.
Yeah.
$15.3 million, a record penalty for underpaying staff more than $650,000. But quite importantly, in that case, the federal court imposed a penalty of $1.6 million against the owner and sole director of the Sushi Bay companies.
Yep.
Civil penalties and the imposition of them are ramping up. The maximum penalties we know are increasing. We have the serious contravention space. What are your plans going forward in relation to deterrent outcomes and achieving deterrence in terms of joining HR directors who are accessorially involved in contraventions, or other individuals, directors for that matter, within companies who engage in significant underpayments?
We will always look to see whether there are natural persons, who have been knowingly involved. To quote, I suppose, the law, Section 550 of the Fair Work Act is very helpful, the accessorial liability, and we'll always use it if we can. For the reason that whilst companies are legal entities in their own right, the minds of companies are actually in the minds of the people who manage and direct those companies. And so Sushi Bay is a perfect example. The individual concerned had history and had contravened before, and that's of course part of the judge's consideration in the penalty. And for a second reason too, and that is often companies go into liquidation. This is part of the legal framework supports our capitalist economy and provides for that to able to be occur. The collateral damage, if you like, that occurs through that is that often it happens either before we litigate or whilst we're litigating, and we are not able to recover either compensation or the underpayments or the penalty. So if we've been able to identify an individual and there's a penalty, as there was in, I think it's Ms. Shin is the name of the person concerned, we're able to obtain that penalty from her because she has assets, and use that to pay back the workers, which in this case the judge specifically directed would occur. Also, another case more recent, we thought this was a very good penalty when we got it, but it was eclipsed obviously by Sushi Bay.
You've always got to do better.
That's right. Din Tai Fung, a dumpling chain. And the World Square venue of Din Tai Fung, we achieved penalties not just against the director but also the human resources coordinator, who were clearly found by the court to have been involved in the contravention. So this is actually a very important part of our litigation strategy.
In terms of the accessorial liability of human resources advisors and the like, what are you looking for in that space in terms of their level of involvement?
Did I say at the outset that I'm not a lawyer? I said I was married to one, surrounded by them, so I'm going to stay away from speculating about, precisely what they're looking for, because I'm sure there's a legal answer to that and I don't have it. Yeah. But I would just say, generically, we're looking for evidence of their conscious involvement.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you very much, Anna. Look, that brings us to the end of our questions. There would be many more that we could ask you. We've canvassed a lot of topics. Not surprising considering your significant remit that seems to only be getting bigger. 1 year into the job, and you touched on 4 years to go. You're very enthused by it, and we've been really grateful for you bringing that enthusiasm and knowledge and 45 years of insights here today. on our episode.
35, remember, we corrected.
I'm happy to come back on my 1-year anniversary every year for the next 5 years just to see how I've gone.
Okay.
Hold me to
Fantastic.
account.
And we will have cake on the next occasion, I promise.
We'll hold you to it. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you.
We really appreciate you joining us on Perspectives.
Thanks so much, Anna.
Perspectives on Closing Loopholes with Clayton Utz, and thanks to our viewers for joining us today.